All right. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's Common Ground, where every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, we will feature conversations with social justice practitioners, change makers, and activists on how we can mobilize our daily action to radically reimagine our democracy. We'll be going up until the election in November, so stay tuned. I'm Malvika Jolly, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for an extra special conversation on curatorial activism, featuring artist Patricia Cronin and curators Cecilia Fajardo-Hill, Nur Sobers-Khan, and Jasmine Wahi in conversation with the luminous Maura Reilly. We are also so lucky to have the poet and translator Kamilo Roldan here with us today, who will read to close today's program. Before we begin, the Brooklyn Rail also acknowledges the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded land and waters on which we stand. The Brooklyn Rail also stands in solidarity with the uprisings unfolding currently across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, and Toyin Salau, among countless others, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. Before I introduce our illustrious guests, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. And now to introduce today's wonderful host and panelist. Maura Reilly is a curator who has organized dozens of exhibitions internationally with a specific focus on marginalized artists. She has written extensively on global contemporary art and curatorial practice, including most recently Curatorial Activism Towards an Ethics of Curating, which came out in 2018 and which was named a top 10 best art book of 2018 by the New York Times. She is the founding curator of the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum, AO, where she developed and launched the first exhibition and public programming space in the United States devoted entirely to feminist art. While there, she organized several landmark exhibitions, including Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party, the blockbuster Global Feminisms, which she co-curated with the formidable Linda Nochlin, and Ghada Amer, Love Has No End, among many others. She's a founding member of two initiatives dedicated to fighting discrimination against women in the art world. Those are the Feminist Art Project and Feminist Curators United. Additionally, in 2015, she was named one of the top 50 most influential people in the art world by Art and Auction in recognition of her advocacy. Maura received her MA and PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, and is an editor-at-large for us here at the Brooklyn Rail. She currently serves as an associate professor of art history and museum studies at Arizona State University. And finally, her forthcoming book, Museum Reckoning, examines the many ethical issues museums are currently reconciling with or not reconciling with, from toxic philanthropy to decolonization to corporatization and Black Lives Matter. Without further ado, Maura, take it away.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Nick. Especially Feng Bui for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Feng. I want to start also by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work in New York. I want to express emphatically that it always was theirs and always will be their land. Now, curatorial activism was born out of a frustration with, and indeed a rage. Wait, hold on, you're gonna let me read my notes. I can't see them. How do I do that? Okay, thank you. Was born out of a frustration with and indeed rage about the pervasive and systemic sexism and racism in the art world. So as an activist, it is entirely unacceptable to me that the museum and gallery worlds disproportionately favor white males and that the patriarchal white suprematism reigns supreme still. The disparities continue to be visible in permanent collections, as was reported in 2019 study by Williams College that concluded, you can see here above, and this are in this image in particular, They concluded that the artists in 18 major US museums are 85% white, 85% white and 87% male. So clearly we have some work to do. So it's also been well documented that the inequality is also visible in solo exhibition schedules, group exhibitions, gallery representation, and art auction price differentials. I still can't see my notes.
If you press escape, then the screen share will become smaller and you can see your notes.
Perfect, thank you. Now we also know that the issues in and around race and gender persist on an operational level. So many of you might recall that in 2015, the Mellon Foundation and the AMD produced a report that found that 72% of staff at its member institutions identify as white. So that these conversations, like we're having today, persist and continue to demonstrate that we still have a long, long way to go. And in response to these continued inequities, today's panel takes as its subject curatorial activism. And you can read along with me there how I've defined it. And so curatorial activism is a term that I use to designate the practice of organizing art exhibitions with the principal aim of ensuring that large constituencies of artists are no longer ghettoized or excluded from the master narratives of art. It is a practice that commits itself to counter hegemonic initiatives that give voice to those who have been historically silenced or omitted altogether. And as such, curatorial activism focuses almost exclusively on work produced by women, artists of color, non-Euro-Americans, and/or queer artists. Now, the book itself, Curatorial Activism, takes as its operative assumption that the art system, its history, institutions, market, press, and so forth is a hegemony that privileges white male creativity to the exclusion of all other artists. It also insists that this, white Western male viewpoint, which has been unconsciously accepted as the prevailing viewpoint, may and does prove to be inadequate, not merely on moral and ethical grounds, or because it is elitist, but on purely intellectual ones. Now, in today's panel, we will hear from 4 inspirational individuals whose curatorial, artistic, and/or research practice seeks to dismantle patriarchal white supremacism and/or to decolonize the legacy of colonial violence. Now, each has dedicated her come overtly so, and others in a more stealth fashion. Now, in the end, what I hope we'll glean from this panel is an action plan, a roadmap, so that we can all continue to work together collectively to address these disparities head on. Now, I'm going to begin the panel with Patricia Cronin because we're doing this in alphabetical order. And I'll read to you Patricia's esteemed, kind of amazing biography here. So Patricia Cronin is an interdisciplinary conceptual artist whose work examines issues of sexuality, gender, and social justice. Cronin's work has been exhibited widely in the US and internationally, including her installation Shrine for Girls at the 56th Venice Biennale, after which the installation traveled to the Flag Art Foundation in New York City and then the Lab Gallery in Dublin. Now, other exhibitions were presented, other solo exhibitions by Patricia were presented at the Capitoloni Museum Centrale Montemartini, sorry, Patty, for pronunciation, Museum in Rome, the Newcomb Art Museum in New Orleans, the Brooklyn Museum, the Temple Museum of Art, etc. Now, her pioneering marriage equality sculpture that she'll be talking about today, that's titled Memorial to a Marriage, has been exhibited across the globe, including in Glasgow, in Rome, at the American Academy, and throughout the United States. Her work is in major permanent collections, like the Kelvin Grove Art Gallery and Museum in Glasgow, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, the Flag Art Foundation, Paris Art Museum, Miami, and of course, the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where the sculpture is on permanent view on her burial plot. Now, Patricia is a professor of art at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. So I'll turn it over to Patricia. Thank you, Patricia.
For creating this space for us to gather and talk about and share our work. Today I'm going to talk about 2 projects that I think fit the bill of curatorial activism from the position of the artist, which requires a bit of an expanded role from traditional studio practices. With Memorial to a Marriage, I made from 2000 to 2002 I addressed two untenable situations. One cultural, the dearth of specific women being honored in public, and the other, legal, the prohibition of gay marriage in the United States. So I counterbalanced the wedding that couldn't exist with the heaviest, most prestigious and enduring artistic material I knew, marble. Because up until then, the only legal protections a homosexual couple could attain to simulate some of the 1,200 benefits, if we could slow down the slides though, just for a second, benefits of heterosexual marriage was to hire a lawyer, draw up wills, healthcare proxies, and power of attorney documents. I had a deep sense of loss and longing for cultural rituals and civic inclusion. And since these depressing documents only referenced our illness, incapacity, or death, it led me to the natural site for mourning, the cemetery, where the same artists who created the many public monuments in the North celebrating winning the Civil War were commissioned also for funerary sculptures for their prominent clients. Here in the cemeteries, I finally found specific women being honored in public. So I used the patriotic American neoclassical sculpture style, you can see a good vertical picture here, of what was until 2013, what I saw as a federal failure, bearing gay Americans the basic human right of legal marriage with a 3-ton Carrara marble mortuary sculpture, immortalizing myself and my then partner, now wife, Deborah Cass, the artist, in a double portrait of on our burial plot in Woodlawn Cemetery, where it is on view through eternity. If death was all I was going to be legally allowed, I needed to make the most poetic political protest I could think of. The history of sculpture is the history of death. The prominent ruling couples have commissioned artists to sculpt their tombs, sepulchres, sarcophagi for centuries. But historically, it is always the important men in these relationships that would have determined that a memorial in death equal their importance in life, be commissioned by artists of great skill. Now, seldom are female artists of any background selected to make monumental public art in any country ever, right? So then I purchased our burial plot in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, in the Bronx borough in New York City, where my wife's mother and my father grew up, simultaneously ensuring our final resting place and a permanent home for my public art. Or as I tell my female artist friends, if we could stay in the cemetery for a second, yeah. As I tell my female artist friends, if you want to make permanent public art, you have to buy the land. And in 2020, the truth of that statement is completely still infuriating. Woodlawn Cemetery was designed in 1863 as America's Père Lachaise. It's one of the best examples of 19th century garden cemetery movement. It's the resting place of the most prominent American historic figures, including artists, writers, civic leaders, entrepreneurs, jazz entertainers, and musicians. Everyone from Elizabeth Cady Stanton to J.P. Morgan, Joseph Pulitzer, and Madam C.J. Walker. Mausoleums are designed by the infamous architects McKim, Mead, and White with Louis Comfort Tiffany stained glass windows, the heyday of the robber baron years. The opening was planned as a kind of performance. We had structured the day like a funeral, a walking historic tour, a procession through the cemetery. The actual unveiling by an art historian discussing the sculpture was like a graveside service, followed by a reception in the Woolworth Chapel, and then the close friends and family were invited back to our house for the rest of the night. To be clear, this is our actual burial plot, and it is also a work of art. I actually purchased it on a pre-need basis and paid for it in a monthly installment plan over 3 years. So collapsing the symbolism into reality. I like art that multitasks, and I'm a very practical person. The one thing we all know is that we're going to die. And I find it satisfying to know where I'm going to end up. And I get to live my life backwards from whenever my end happens. And I get to ask myself interesting questions like, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of decisions do I want to make? What kind of art do I want to make? I first installed the marble before gay marriage was legal anywhere in the US. And I feared that someone might come along with a sledgehammer and vandalize it. In fact, I remember a museum director laughing in my face when I told her what this big project was that I was working on. I can't stress how unpopular this theme was, especially about a lesbian couple in even the early 2000s. But I didn't care. I was just gonna bet the farm and, thank goodness for credit cards is all I can say, along with a lot of other people, because I had to fundraise to make this happen. But my real fear of homophobia precipitated bronzes, and that was really fortuitous because I had to make a mold. It was almost like an insurance policy. And I literally put it on an American Express card to preserve the form in case someone came and damaged it. And so then I started making bronzes. You know, marble isn't the best thing for outside. And eventually, this is at the Brooklyn Museum, you know, a curator came to me and said, we're doing this big show, Open House New York at the Brooklyn Museum. You know, do you have a bronze? We'd like to put this with the Rodins. And I thought, well, that's not a fair compare and contrast. You know, the poor woman artist, you know, against like a great master. So again, you know, trying to figure out how to think outside the box, and that ultimately that kind of thinking got me inside the box. This is a picture of the full-size one at the Smithsonian, which they actually own. But you need to, oh, hold on one second. But you'll need to develop more skills to be an artist who's going to do curatorial activism, because you have to be not just a project manager, not just the artist, you have to deal with all different kinds of entities, nonprofit and profit, to get your work done. So then we can go to Shrine for Girls. In 2014, the Italian curator Ludovico Pratesi invited me to make a show for the Venice Biennale. We can stay on this slide for a little bit, please. Thank you, Malvika. To coincide with the 70th anniversary of the United Nations passing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and to address a global pandemic of violence against women, the kidnapped, the trafficked, the murdered, and the disappeared girls and women, I decided to create a shrine in their honor. Chosen by the first commissioner of African descent, Okwi Inweezer, and the Diocese of Venice, okay? Two big entities. Shrine for Girls debuted as an official solo collateral show for the 56th Venice Biennale. And the Brooklyn Rail was eager to be my nonprofit sponsoring organization. So it's just great to show this on a Brooklyn Rail platform. Fong Bui contributed to the catalog, as well as Maura Reilly. So inside this 16th century church of San Gallo, I focused on 3 horrific events. We can go to the next slide, that I just couldn't shake. Boko Haram kidnapping schoolgirls in Chibok, Nigeria, the gang rape and lynching of 2 teenage cousins in Uttar Pradesh, and the lifelong incarceration at forced labor Catholic institutions known as Magdalen Laundries, predominantly in Ireland. So I gathered hundreds of girls' clothes from these countries and carefully composed them on 3 stone altars to act as relics for what I considered these gender martyrs. The feminist gesture of placing their relics on top of a place where previously the sacred relics had existed, had been placed, largely went unnoticed by the press. Also that I brought 3 major world religions under one roof also eluded quite a number of articles. Shrines are part of every major religion's practice. They provide a space for contemplation and petition and rituals of grieving and remembrance. Inside the deconsecrated church, I used a light, minimalist, interventionist touch, a nod to the Arte Povera movement to remind us of what we all have in common is our shared humanity, flesh and bone, organs and brains, our bodies. Each sculpture is accompanied by a small photograph related to the tragic event, positioned discreetly off to the side. This allowed each viewer to have their own individually timed narrative and arc and interaction with the work. By creating an installation with the remembrance of what the missing bodies would have inhabited, the materiality of the fabric reminds us of who's missing and publicly acknowledges their suffering. Commemorating their spirit, this site-specific installation is a meditation on the incalculable loss of unrealized potential and hopelessness in the faith of unfathomable cruelty, juxtaposed against the obligation we have as citizens of the world to combat this prejudice. I attempted to restore some semblance of dignity these women and girls were denied in life. And so we can go to the high altar one. There's 3 images. I arranged a pile of saris, next slide, of a specific event in a tiny village of Katra in northern India in the state of Uttar Pradesh on March 27th in 2014. Next slide. 2 cousins, 14 and 15-year-old Murti and Pushpa, were raped, murdered, and left to hang from a mango tree. Next slide. The police wanted to cut down their bodies and make this go away as quickly as possible, make it disappear. And the villagers wouldn't let them and formed a silent protest because they wanted everyone to see what had been done to their children. And it was just enough time that a few people took pictures on their cell phones and it was widely circulated. Just like technology has become a vital tool. Great, I've got 1 more minute. Just like technology has become a vital tool for fighting racial injustice in the United States. On the next altar, there's a pile of hijabs to represent the students kidnapped from their government secondary school in the village of Chibok in the northern state of Borno in Nigeria on April 14, 2014 by the terrorist group Boko Haram, which sparked a global outrage and inspired the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag. The Nigerian journalist Ahmad Sakika had negotiated for the girls' release on behalf of Goodluck Jonathan's government, although they claimed only 15 of the 112 still missing girls are still alive, and some reports today estimate it's even fewer, only 3 to 4. And then on the altar to the right, a huge pile of cotton, wool, and linen aprons symbolizing girls imprisoned in the Magdalene laundries, run by predominantly the Sisters of Mercy. I know you can't make this stuff up. In Ireland, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and even the United States. Any female or minor or adult that jeopardized a family's moral reputation, orphans, unwanted girls, the precocious, those of low mental capacity, unwed mothers, prostitutes, were sent by their families, if we can hold on here, were sent by their families and or law enforcement. No specific crime was committed, no legal sentence, no end date. Their names were taken away. They were starved, their heads were shaved, deliberately not educated, and worked doing laundry for the government, clergy, and the wealthy. They worked from dawn to dark, and their babies were sold to rich Americans. So my goal for these sculptures was to move the viewer, get under their skin, and resonate enough so that they take some action. I identified 3 nonprofits related to each of the events you saw on the didactic labels when you were leaving. CamFed, the campaign for, Campaign for Female Education in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Gulabi Gang, and the Justice for the Magdalenes, a survivors resource group. And I've pledged to provide 10% of all my profits from any sales of any work from this project into perpetuity to these 3 organizations. So in closing, I believe empathy is at the core of all great art. Art can humanize the shock of violence and transform trauma into a shared experience. It can help carry the load, lighten the psychic burden, collapsing symbolism into reality. Art can be a call to action and a form of healing. Thank you.
Here. Okay. So Patricia, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to asking you some questions about those 2 pieces. I would like to introduce Cecilia Fajardo-Hill right now, and she is a British Venezuelan art historian and curator with a specialization in modern and contemporary Latin American art. She's currently based in Southern California and New York. Cecilia holds a PhD in art history from the University of Essex and an MA in 20th century art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. She was co-curator of the groundbreaking feminist blockbuster exhibition, Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960 to 1985, which premiered at the Hammer Museum 2016, I think, and then traveled to the Brooklyn Museum and finally to the Pinacoteca in Sao Paulo in 2018, where I saw it. Cecilia is the editor of the forthcoming book, Remains Tomorrow, Themes in Contemporary Latin American Abstraction, which examines post-1990s abstraction in Latin America. She's a co-editor of a forthcoming book on 20th and 21st century Guatemalan art. It's an initiative of Harvard University and the Arte GT 20/21 in Guatemala. She's a visiting scholar at the Chicano Studies Research Center at UCLA and the co-curator of Chicanx Body, a touring exhibition organized by the American Federation of Arts and the Phoenix Art Museum that opens in 2022. Cecilia is working also on a book on decolonization, decolonizing Latin American and Latinx art history in the 20th and 21st centuries, with a specific focus on class, feminism, gender, indigeneity, African heritage, and popular culture. Thank you so much, Cecilia, for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. I've been a great admirer of Maura's work that has been able to articulate what it means a practice like many of us. So as you saw from Maura's presentation, I am an art historian by training, and my sort of quest began then by realizing that there was huge chunks of art history in the world and that was completely kind of invisible and not in the books, and also my body and the body of my companions, which we were not in any way canonical bodies, was also completely absent or was only present in the guise of some sort of maid in some sort of colonial picture. So as I made a decision not to be simply an academic person, because I find that history is a discipline that is very much about specialization. And with the curatorial practice, I find that what is interesting is a dialogical process, not only with the artists you work with and with the whole scope of collaborators that you have. Susan Hiller used to call them the producers of art, from any person that participates in an institution, but also you have a sort of an ethical sort of duty in a way to both artists and the public. Therefore, you know, the insularity of art history becomes something different. And also because I'm critical of art history as a discipline, because I continue to see that a lot of the art that I would like to promote and see and understand is actually not present in the books. So I made a decision already quite a few years ago. I started to curate in the 1980s. It's been a slow, long process to actually only work on those areas of art history and contemporary art that I feel that have been oppressed, stereotyped, eliminated, made invisible. And of course, at the center of that is always women. And I consider myself a person that defends an intersectional notion of feminism. And this exhibition, which is the first project I'm going to talk about, Radical Women, is a project that took, you know, it took 8 years to produce. I co-curated it with Andrea Giunta. There were a massive amount of collaborators, women artists, and so forth for the project. But for me, the interesting experience about this project was that while I was doing the exhibition, all sorts of stuff happened to me, from being thrown out the institution, being scorned by my colleagues. We had an enormous amount of obstacles to produce the project. And for me, it was very much living in my own flesh what it must have been for women to try to actually put there and have a space, a voice within an art system that was completely kind of not giving space to them. So it did become, in a way, something that transformed me enormously, also because I met some of the most amazing women in the world. The fact that you can have a resilience and a resistance that actually allows you to continue to say things to the world, even though the world is actually not being generous about receiving it. One of the exhibition covered from 1685, one of the things that we did was that we included Latina and Chicana women, which in the art historical fields you actually don't do. There was a subject called self-portrait, which was very important because the whole issue of self-representation, as men have been always the guiding principle of the notion of representation, was very important. There was a lot of stating in this project, in the sense that there was a declaration of a situation of oppression, but at the same time a defiance of this oppression. So the whole exhibition had this kind of dialectical nature of challenging and so forth. So the next theme, which was, it had to do with the landscape. You can move this next slide. It was the relationship of the body and the landscape. The whole center, the whole notion of the exhibition was around the notion of the political body, a body that was trying to reinstate itself, decolonize, being political, and not only in the present time, because you know the moment we actually opened the exhibition was the time that Donald Trump had been elected. There were all the marches by women in the streets, and it resonated a lot, the fact that these women actually fought so hard during the time. And I always think of a subject such as this, which was profoundly poetic, about this idea that this non-violent relationship that women, that has been stereotyped so much, or this relationship with the body and the nature of whatever surrounds you. Here, I think it demonstrated very clearly that it's something that we need profoundly, if you want. So mapping the body was a very important part of the exhibition, because it was about recontextualizing the body. Like you have this kind of an almost enormous vagina in the middle of space, kind of somehow with poor material, defining all these kind of bellies that have been completely cut off, because there were so many dictatorships during this time in Latin America. We always think of the sanctity of pregnant women, but the reality is women during times of war and oppression, and even today where the violence towards women is so prominent, pregnant women were not sacred, where pregnant women were treated in a terrible way. You can move to the next theme. For example, we had a Perform in the Body, which was about this kind of the imagination of notions of performance, dance, performativity, and things. In Latin America, there has been a resistance in thinking of performance as a terminology, which is an American They used to also be called non-objectal art and so forth. The next page. This was resistance and fear. There was a large, very large and difficult section in the exhibition that had to do with the art that was produced in Latin America by women during the time of dictatorship. And even though women, you know, when you look at the history of Latin American art and the history of conceptual art and the history of political art, women simply were not there. And women were producing powerful work because also were profoundly affected by this kind of histories. For example, this enormous piece in the front of us is actually has a slang name for a ham, but it really means a body, you know, the way the bodies would be just left in the streets. In the end, I didn't hold my time, so please let me know. And at the end, if you see at the end of it, the slide, well, is not, at the end of the show, there was the eros, there was the erotics, which meant that you have this sort of relationship also within, at the end of the day, there is an affirmative aspect of all the arts. This again is repression and fear, about torture of young people in Colombia or torture during the time of, you know, in Chile. This section had to do with feminism, was feminism plural, because as we know, feminism has different facets. For example, for the Chicana women, there has been a whole discussion about different forms of feminism, which is not white feminism. And then you had feminists from Mexico and from women like Lea Lublin. The next slide. This is again as another, one of the things that we did with this exhibition, which it was the notion that this exhibition should not be, I mean, the slides somehow when I look at them, a lot of people criticize it as being too crowded, but for us it was very, very important that whatever you were looking at, you were actually relating a work with something else. It wasn't about just simply highlighting individual art. It was highlighting a community of women that if you were maybe in Chile, you were maybe in a Chicana woman, but you were actually being faced with the same notions of oppression or same sensibilities. So the idea was to create this kind of chorus and voices of all these women, but not highlighting them in the way that we normally do in museum, where we fetishize a work and normally it's a work of a white male. Next slide. This was so-called social place. It was about, you know, is an area which related to all sorts of issues of oppression, from poverty in children, marginalization, class issues, issues of indigeneity, and so forth. Next slide. And then here again, I mean, for example, if you look at the left image here, you have two women, Marcia Schwartz, talking across. It was a very monumental piece, which actually had the real objects of a bird cage and so forth. These are the sort of women that you don't see in art history or represented. They're not beautiful, they're not canonical, they're nothing. They're just popular women talking across a balcony, and paying an homage to this is an important thing, or talking about red tape in Los Angeles. This was the last theme in the exhibition, the erotic, which had different configuration of the notion of a sort of an erotic imagination. This was particularly important to end the exhibition like that. You began with the self-representation of, you know, the woman and the face and the body, and then you went through the landscape, you went through the pain of the war and the feminism stating, and then in the end you ended up, as it were, kind of being ejected by the vagina of women. So there was a sort of this idea that, you know, there is a conceptual thread throughout, and there is a political thread throughout, and there is a enactment of this kind of political positioning in the world, in spite of the fact that you're not being acknowledged by this world. Okay, so anyhow, so that exhibition was very important. As a woman, I am from the 1960s, to pay homage, and I feel that there is something that we need to do, especially as women and as human beings, to acknowledge other women, recognize them, and, you know, give them a voice, give us a voice. As we do this, we actually somehow we reivindicate ourselves. Now I'm working on another project, which is, as Maura explained, is produced by the Phoenix Art Museum and the American Federation of the Art. I'm co-curating this show with Gilbert Vicaria from the Phoenix Art Museum and from Marisa del Toro. And this show really, I wasn't really quite ready when I finished Writing for Women, because it was 8 years of a lot of work. And in the end, it's not surprising that it was, you know, produced by the Harman Museum, which is a feminist museum, and then by the Brooklyn Museum and so forth. But when the election happened and Pacific Standard Time ended, simply just by seeing the way that Latinx people were being portrayed by society, and museums basically were not doing anything. When museums are so complicit with the way that the system makes people invisible, uses them, marginalizes them, stereotypes them. So why are these people not present in museums who have contributed so much? They contribute from the economy, culture, to art, to humanity, to affectivity. So this is how I started to work on this project again. And the interesting thing about this, for me, I'm rethinking through this exhibition of a lot of issues. For example, pop art. Pop art in the US has been very much shaped by a notion that has a lot to do with mass culture. And there is a political form of pop which comes from actually a critique of the actual values, like, the phallocratic race by Mel Casas. And this is a piece that is from 1967. You can keep going. Or for example, you have other works here which again criticize, the great symbol in Esther Hernandez, who is a Chicana artist based in San Francisco, that is actually shaping the Statue of Liberty with sort of Native Americans, or the American dream with this sort of objectification of women. You can move to the next. Or for example, now there is this horrific news in the news that women in detention center have been sterilized in a forced way. This is an activity that the US has done with Native American women, African American women, and Latina women. And it's happening again at this moment in time. So Isabel Castro talks about this in 1980s. At the time was actually something that wasn't being seen, or for example, undocumented, the way that, migrants are faced through violence. Again, the next slide. Or for example, Ken Gonzalez-Day, who has developed about 8 years and produced a very important academic book about lynching of Latino people in the US. And there is all this postcard. The work is incredibly powerful because it's something that we don't really know about. The next slide. Or for example, issues that have to do with race. The Latinx, there is a very completely flat notion of Latinx. Latinx are represented, there is such a thing as a Blaxicans, which are Black Latinx people. You have Japanese Chicanx people, you have indigenous Latinx people. So this idea also tries to bring in this sort of racial complexity. And then you have James Luna, who died recently, was an incredible performance artist, who's half indigenous and half Mexican. Or Vincent Valdez, The Strangest Fruit, again, talking about the notion of lynching of Latinx men still today. The next image. For example, these are also, there is a lot in the exhibition that deals with the idea of authority. Alexis Donis that makes these sort of queer type of works where, the cholo would actually be dancing with the police, or images of people struggling when they're being deported from the country. Next page. Or someone like Judy Baca, who's a very important muralist artist, who's very well known, again, playing with this role of being a Pachuca, and you have a chol, and this is herself. And there is a mirror in the center of these Tres Marias, which basically to see the piece, you need to be the third Maria. So you create a social fabric that normally people reject, because Los Angeles, despite the fact it's a liberal place, is actually completely closed off to the notion of Chicano and Chicana art. Aside from the Vincent Price Museum in East LA, John Valadez with East LA project, because a lot of the reason why this exhibition is called Body, because when we have, nowadays in society, Latinx people in the streets dying for us to provide the basic services during COVID, basically we don't value that body. We make that body invisible. We don't see it. This is about creating a visibility towards this body, the particular aesthetic. For example, Fabian Guerrero, that produces this whole series of queer rancheros from, Latinx people. So it's about a celebration also of this body, or talking about gentrification. Or Ramiro Gomez, who is an artist from LA, who produces, he was a nanny for a while, these images where he actually places the invisible people of the maids and the cleaners that normally are Latinx in the houses, inside these beautiful magazines. Again, the next slide.
Cecilia, just wanted to have you round it up, please.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, and also kind of queer as imagination. You can go to the next. is the last slide. And then, for example, popular culture, low culture, the notions of Latinx car and queer women, and the lower right is normally seen as patriarchal. I don't know if there is another slide. Again, another one. I mean, this is to give you sort of a sense of what these images are, but I feel, I mean, my thing is that there is an urgency for a presence in the art system of the contribution and the voices and the particular perspective, conceptual and aesthetics of these artists who are so powerful, so important, have been for so long. And I wanted to suggest that you go and look at the website of In Plain Sight. That it was an event that was organized by Castles and Rafa Esparza for the 4th of July. And in that website, there are many lists of institutions and activists in the country that are trying to help for migrants and incarceration and so forth, if you want to collaborate with the causes. Thank you. I think Maura is trying to
unmute. Okay, you guys had me locked out. Okay, so Cecilia, thank you. I'm really excited to see that show. So excited. It's really groundbreaking, and as always, I think that's the work that you do. So thank you for that. I want to introduce Nur Sobers-Khan. She is the lead curator for the South Asian collections at the British Library in London. And she's responsible for curating a collection of books and manuscripts on the history of Islam in South Asia. Her current work, which she'll be speaking about today, focuses on dismantling the structures of colonial violence that are embedded in the curation and exhibition of the collections at the library. So most recently, she's been involved in the efforts of the library's Decolonizing working group, which she helped found. And it aims to reconfigure the interpretation of artworks on display in the public and staff areas of the building, specifically calling attention to the histories of imperial and colonialist violence that are embedded in their description or lack thereof. She's also curated many other exhibitions, one of which is of great interest to me, called Qajar Women, Images of Women in 19th Century Iran, which she co-curated with Munia Chekhab Abu Daya, which took place at the Museum of Islamic Art in Qatar. And it explored historical depictions of non-binary gendered identities in the context of canonical constructions of Islamic art. She's currently a principal investigator of the AHRC-funded research and digitization project titled 2 Centuries of Indian Print. And her research pivots around 2 questions at the moment: the role of the dispersal and removal of cultural heritage artifacts in South Asia under British colonialism as a contributing factor in the shaping the emergence of Islamic reformism in the second half of the 19th century. And the second part of that research is about the transition from manuscript to print in the same period and its creation of new forms of reading and poetic improvisation through the circulation of texts on cosmology, dream interpretation, and other genres of divinatory literature. Nur completed her BA and PhD in Oriental Studies at the University of Cambridge. Nur, thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to hear what you're going to share with us.
Not at all. It's a real pleasure to be here. And so I don't have as many images to show you as the other participants. So I think you're just going to be seeing me for about 9 minutes, and then you'll have some images at the end. And let me just put my timer on to make sure that I stay within time. So I basically am coming from a slightly different context. So I don't work so much with contemporary art, but I work with historical collections of manuscripts, books, images. So I would like to give you first a little bit of background to the collection that I curate in an institutional setting, and then talk to you a little bit about the transformation, if we can call it that, that the institution has undergone in the past, I would say, 2 to 3 months. So I work at the British Library. I'm responsible for the South Asia collections. I'm, to my knowledge, the first curator of South Asian origin who is responsible for those collections. One thing that many people aren't aware of is that the British Library, until 1972, was actually part of the British Museum. So the collections that I curate, the manuscripts, it's about 20,000 manuscripts, 500,000 books, so very, very big collections, all of which came from India, the majority of which under British colonialism were originally institutionally, in large part, either part of the British Museum or the India Office Library. The British Museum, of course, needs no introduction as a colonialist institution. But to give you a bit of perspective on the British Library, it very much mirrors the sort of colonialist hierarchies that are embedded in the British Museum. So just to give you a few examples, the South Asia collections, for instance, which I curate, not all of them were looted, about half of them were, but I would say that the ones that were not were collected through things like British colonial officials bringing back items with them after a stint of imperialist violence in the subcontinent. So basically the sort of history of colonial violence, British colonial violence, is very much embedded in the physical objects that I curate in the collections. And in my particular case, because it's South Asia that I work on, it's very much British colonial violence in South Asia. However, you have much wider collections that encompass a much wider range of imperialist structures of violence throughout the library. So they're very large collections. So that's just to give you a bit of a background to the collection itself. And it's a difficult place to decolonize, as you might imagine. And the reason for that is because, I mean, it is the colonial archive in many respects. I mean, it also holds things like the entire archive of the East India Company and its rule in not just South Asia, but in all of the realms of the British Empire. It holds the records of the British Raj post, 1857, when, Britain had direct rule over South Asia. So, in many ways, the records, the materials that the library holds, represent kind of the birthplace of colonial epistemologies, colonial knowledge production, racial categories and hierarchies very much were sort of given birth to and then codified in the collections that I work on as a South Asian. So there's a lot of violence already happening there to the bodies of the workers who actually inhabit the space of the library and of the collections. And until recently, many of the colonial and racial hierarchies that are presumed by the collections themselves were reflected in the hiring practices and employment practices of the institution. So I can give you one example, which is a bit exaggerated, but it's sort of stranger than fiction almost. But a number of the curators or one or two, I would say, of the curators who are responsible for the collections from South Asia are themselves descendants of British colonial officials and have their sort of ancestral wealth is generated from things like tea plantations in Bengal and actually sort of being in their ancestors being in high positions of authority in the British colonial structures in South Asia. So that is someone who I would be sitting next to, for instance, at work, right? And other sort of South Asian, employees would literally be sat next to people who would sort of regard us as, kind of their ancestral servants, basically. I mean, it's as stark as that in some moments. And why am I telling you this? It's basically just to paint a picture of an organization for you that you might imagine would be very, very difficult to decolonize and very, very difficult to actually engage in some kind of curatorial activism. And the reason why I'm not talking to you about exhibitions and representation of artists and these much more sophisticated narratives of how to engage in curatorial activism is because there were some sort of very fundamental levels of kind of labor activism that needed to take place before we could actually embark on a discourse of representation, exhibitions, and engagement and audiences. So that sort of, I hope, gives you a bit of an introduction to the organization. Very interesting things would happen, like, a curator who was a descendant of, a British colonial official would do things like call up a collection item from the basement. That would be, the Treaty of Plassey, which, for those of you who don't know, is kind of the treaty that established British rule in South Asia. this person would call up the treaty, gather all of the South Asian origin workers around and show it to them, basically, and kind of demonstrate, look, this is what we hold. We hold the document that signifies the moment when your ancestors' lives were entirely changed, and basically when your existence in the West was created, right? So, and I hold this document and I'm the curator of it. So there were these very sort of violent gestures that would take place, you know, through the collections and you know, instrumentalizing the collections. So this is the set of materials that we're working with when a decolonizing working group it came into existence. And Maura very kindly said that I was one of the founders of it. I'm not actually. It very much came together organically. And I have to say that what I'm about to represent and what I'm sort of talking to you about today is very much a collective effort. It's not just me. It's really a group of us. Thank you. Okay, how far along am I? Because I actually have quite a bit still to say. So what we did.
You can take some extra time, Nur.
Okay, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I gave a lot of context because I feel like I'm coming from a very different background to a contemporary art context. So I wanted to make sure that was sort of clear. So basically, this past summer, we had a decolonizing working group that came together. We identified that there's a serious problem in terms of hiring practices, in terms of the way that staff of color and curators of color are treated. We're often on fixed term contracts rather than permanent contracts. We are paid less, we are bullied. There's a really endemic problem of sort of structural racism and the treatment of staff of color in the library. So that was one of our issues. The other issue was the fact that the way that the collections are interpreted and narrated, at no point prior to the summer of 2020 was the organization willing to acknowledge that the collections were accumulated through a process of colonial and imperialist violence. Those words were never used. We were not allowed to use them internal to the organization or external to the organization. So when we set up a decolonizing working group, some of our immediate demands, which we put into an open letter, basically were, and I wish I could share the open letter with you, but it's actually recently, I mentioned in some of the preliminary conversations to this, it was sort of taken by the right-wing press and sort of misrepresented. So it's a very sensitive document that I can't actually share, unfortunately. But we basically put together a series of demands in an open letter to our board of trustees and to the senior management of the organization. A number of those demands were very much of a sort of labor activism nature. You know, we would like equal pay, we would like better treatment. We want an end to fixed term contracts. We want an end to bullying of staff of color. We would like, you know, people of color to feel safe in the working environment and an end to harassment. You know, sort of these sorts of demands, they were laid out in very stark terms. Oh, that's my timer. And we also requested that the institution acknowledge for the first time that there is a history of colonial violence underpinning the existence of the organization and the collections. So we wrote this letter, we had it signed by about 200 staff members. So there was great support out of a total staff of about 1,600 people. And we presented it to the Board of Trustees. This was in the sort of the wake of Black Lives Matter. So there was a sort of global kind of, you know, dynamic and impetus to actually enact institutional change. So that very much sort of gave us a lot of energy to kind of take on these really deeply embedded, you know, white supremacist structures in our institution. So we had an open letter that was received, responded to, and then we followed it up by a 50-page audit that aimed to decolonize the public space of the library. So what do we mean by decolonizing the public space of the library? Basically, the architecture of the building itself is modeled after a battleship, which is the sort of, you know, symbol par excellence of British, you know, imperialist violence. So there's nothing we can do about the architecture itself, but as you go inside, much of the art on display sort of unapologetically represents or glorifies British imperial violence. So if you go to the reading room where you will look at materials from Asia, if you sit in a desk in that reading room, on the wall is a giant insignia of the East India Company, for instance, sort of unapologetically there without any curatorial interpretation. As soon as you walk into the building, at the entryway, you're faced with 4 busts of the founding collectors of the institution, 2 of whom have sort of very egregious histories of colonial violence. There was no interpretation, no plaque, nothing explaining who they are, just that they're in this sort of exalted position. So what we requested initially, at least, is just a kind of acknowledgement from the institution that these founding collectors were able to collect what they did because of the wealth that they gained through imperialist and colonial violence. So we went in the space of about 2 months. So in May 2020, we are not able to use the word colonial violence in even internal documents. To July of 2020, we now have a plaque at the entryway to the institution explaining how the collections themselves have been created basically through a history of imperial and colonial violence. And I'll just quickly close by reading you the words that now greet visitors to the institution. So there are 2 plaques in particular, 2 busts in particular that were very problematic. And one is of Hans Sloane and the other is Joseph Banks. Joseph Banks is, of course, famous for his expeditions to what would later become Australia, and sort of depredation and disaster that led to for the indigenous peoples of Australia. The other bust that's in place is of I'm sorry, that's Joseph Banks, who was in Australia, and then Sir Hans Sloane is the one who is another founding collector of the institution, and his wealth and his collections were basically created through wealth that he gained through being a slaver, and basically through engaging in for owning slave plantations in Jamaica. And so we wanted to highlight this history of violence. So now these busts have an interpretation that we wrote, and it is written by a member of staff who is of Jamaican ancestry, and she narrates the bust with what I'm about to read to you now. It is too often said that the transatlantic slave trade is long behind us. An untold number of our ancestors' lives were completely ruined by men like Hans Sloane. Every one of their waking moments filled with violent abuse, torture, unpaid manual labor, rape, and treatment as if less than human. That pain and trauma is still with us as we fight to make a world that is truly anti-racist. We cannot allow the glorification of enslavers and their legacies to make a world that is we cannot allow the glorification of enslavers and their legacies to continue through succeeding generations. We must remember these men for who they truly were, for their crimes as well as their accomplishments. So this is the text that now, previously there was no text, no interpretation, and now we have an open calling out of the fact that the institution, its collections are founded on these deeply troubling histories. So, and what you're seeing here is an image of that plinth and that interpretation. So I appreciate in the context of the contemporary art world, this might not seem particularly radical or revolutionary, and in fact, it might just be very obvious if you're familiar with the history of the British Museum or the British Library. But what I wanted to present to you is a picture of what the institution was 3 months ago, where you can't even articulate the fact that colonial violence, imperialist violence, slavery went into the creation of these institutions, to today, just a few months later, when we are now introducing visitors into the space of the organization with a text that openly calls out the violent histories that go into the creation of the collections. So that's it from me.
Wow. No, that's, I'm just astounded that you said it wasn't radical and revolutionary. I mean, it is.
It's only our first step, right? I mean, like, this is like our first little step, and then we're like, okay, now we want more. Like, we want more than this. So
it's unbelievable. Yeah. And for a country that's infinitely younger than the UK, to grapple with just the omnipotence of the British Museum and the British Library, and the fact that you're able to move mountains, and to me, that's a mountain. And I want to thank you for the work you're doing. And we'll talk more about it when we get to the Q&A. So thank you. And now I have to introduce Jasmine Wahi. She is the Holly Block Social Justice Curator at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. She is the founder and co-director of Project for Empty Space, which I hope you've visited. It's a Newark-based nonprofit organization that supports artists who are interested in social discourse and activism. Jasmine's practice predominantly focuses on issues of female empowerment and complicating binary structures within social discourses and exploring multi-positional cultural identities through the lens of intersectional feminism. In 2019, Wahi joined the TED speaker family with a TED Talk, which I highly recommend people watch. It's amazing. It's on intersectionality and visibility. It's entitled All the Women in Me Are Tired. Her work has been highlighted in Art Forum, New York Times, Hyperallergic, Art News, Artsy, Vogue, et cetera, et cetera. She is a visiting critic at Yale University and a faculty member of the School of Fine Arts in the MFA Fine Arts Department. She received her master's in art history from my alma mater, from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts. She wants us to know that she lives with her Chihuahua mutt, Momo, in Brooklyn. And I want to end by saying that you should, if you're not, follow Jasmine on Instagram under Brown Girl Curator. She has 22,000 followers. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jasmine. Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you. All right, well, I don't really know how to follow up everyone else, and nor just to reiterate what Maura said, I think what you have accomplished in 3 months is more than what most American institutions have accomplished in their entire existence, which is a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today, but I think we can absolutely learn from your example. And I hope that everyone who is here listening can advocate to their museums and institutions to have similar plaques acknowledging the violent histories upon which our institutions are founded. And I guess, is it possible to bring up my slides? I'm just going to leave this with you for a second. This is my, let me start my timer. This is sort of one of the founding quotes to my practice by one of my favorite scholars and socio-political commentators, Bell Hooks, from a text that I recommend to everyone who will listen to me speak and to all of my students. I think it really demonstrates the universality of intersectional feminist theory and how it applies to all of us, whether we realize it or not. So anyway, to go back to what I was saying, actually, before I say that, I'm having sort of a difficult time today. I've been up for the past 3 nights. I tend to take notes on my phone at 3 in the morning when I can't sleep. Normally they're just gibberish, but after hearing about the civil settlement with Breonna Taylor's family, and also hearing about the resurgence of violent rape against women of color and immigrant women, I just can't get over it. You know, my TED Talk is named after a poem by Nur Wahi, and it's a 7-word poem. It continues to resonate with me as a mantra, but I just have to say, as a woman of color, as a South Asian woman, as a woman who comes from a culture with a legacy of patriarchal violence and misogyny, I'm not even tired anymore. I'm afraid, to be totally candid. And so, you know, I made these slides and I realized I was focusing mostly on the feminist work that I've done in the past few years. And I should preface everything that I'm about to say about my work at the museum by saying that I am brand new to the Bronx Museum. I was officially appointed or announced the week before the COVID-19 shutdown. So I have spent far less time there than I would have liked. And I resisted entering the institutional space, which I'll talk a little bit about more, for a very long time, but I am so thrilled to be in a museum that is communities, plural, oriented, and that believes in intersectional and multi-positional politics at its core. So we can go to the next slide just to give you a little bit of background on who I am. So this, as a curator, I try my best to dismantle hierarchical structures, which means I consider myself more of an organizer than a leader, perhaps, or maybe I'm a leader, but less of a director. I like to work collaboratively as much as I can. And when I talk about my Bronx Museum shows, I'll talk a little bit more about collaborating with community and in community as far as a curatorial practice goes. But I just wanted to share that. Oh, can you go back real quick? Sorry. This one image, which is the first sort of public organized happening, I guess for lack of a better word, because I'm not an artist, that I organized in 2017 in response to the very apparent and blatant misogynistic and rape culture, vocalized rape culture endorsement by an artist whose name I don't need to repeat because he's not relevant. But I organized a group of, I think, 17 people of all genders to do a performance outside of the Bowery mural wall called No Means No, in which it was very dramatic. We had blood and poured blood over ourselves and left a handprint for each person or a person in our lives who had been affected by sexual violence. And to me, I think that was a turning point for really leaning into my exploration of sexual violence and violence against women and women of color in particular, although I had done some exploration of that in earlier exhibitions, but this felt like a turning point for me. But as far as my other curatorial practice, and shameless plug, I'm currently in Project for Empty Space with Kambui Olujimi's work behind me, which is really important to me because it's a reflection on grief and memory, which is utterly important at this time. But we can go to the next slide. I co-founded Project for Empty Space with the idea of community, and I was still using community as a singular back then, in mind. And so the majority of our projects, actually not the majority, all of our projects are oriented around social activism and social justice. And we have a residency program, and we also have a feminist incubator. But our residency program is very generally dedicated to social justice and social activism. And part of that, the reason I'm sharing Derek Adams' image, is because part of social justice and activism is joy. And it is about gathering community together, not only to fight, but also to revel and rebel in our happy places, particularly as queer people and people of color and BIPOC people. So you can go to the next slide. And so I'm already running out of time, but just a few examples. This is our feminist incubator, in which we currently cannot, but normally open it up to anyone who would like to come in. We have a feminist reading lounge where people can come in and read books, as you can see on the left, that are, again, oriented around intersectional feminism. Our feminists in residence in the incubator can access it to do research. We are always accepting books. It doesn't have to be specifically on feminism, but it should be about intersectionality. You can keep going. Another participatory project that we did with one of my favorite artists, Camilla, Janon, Rasheed. We actually did this project twice, but is an exploration from actually a few years ago, but I think is, again, still very resonant today, of Black rage and the commodification of rage and movements, and the complex dichotomy between capitalism and activism and what some people would call radical change. Next slide, please. we can just scroll through these until we get to abortion is normal. These are just additional images of previous exhibitions. One, which I really briefly want to touch on, which was the last slide, American Truth, which happened last year. And the premise of this exhibition, which still is at sort of the crux of my practice now, is a questioning of what truth is. As I'm sure everyone knows, we are in an election year, and the question that I'm grappling with right now is what is truth? Because I don't believe in universal truths. I think that universal truth is something that we can agree on, but there's no such thing as universality, as we see by the belief systems on multiple sides of the aisle. So really quickly, because I'm out of time, maybe you can just scroll through the images of Abortion is Normal, which is the last exhibition that I did before joining the Bronx Museum and right before shutdown. Maura, do I have a minute to touch on it really quickly? Okay. So I'm sharing this because this exhibition is also a turning point for me, even though it was just 6 months ago, in realizing that as a curator and as an institutional curator, I'm no longer really interested in making shows and exhibitions that are trying to convince other people outside of the communities that I find myself in of my validity, or of the artists I'm showing validity. And I think that is, some people have told me it's sort of radical. I don't think it's radical, but that's because I think it. But essentially what I'm saying is I have come to a point in my personal and professional philosophy that I don't want to convince someone that I matter or that Black Lives Matter. And the exhibitions that I make are for people with whom that resonates. And it sounds like it's preaching to the choir, but in reality, I think there needs to be more space for camaraderie and community, particularly within the communities that I serve, both in Newark and the Bronx. And that is my objective. And so the final thing I'll say is two of the largest exhibitions I am doing next year are done completely in curatorial collaboration with members of those communities. And I talk about this because I hope this is something other curators will consider, is as part of decolonizing, when you make exhibitions about communities that you are not necessarily part of, you include those communities' voices in an active and prominent way in your exhibition, rather than taking a voyeuristic lens, which I know is not the intention of most people, but direct voices are important, and I think should be at the crux of any institutional space if that institutional space claims to be for the people. And that's all.
Thank you. Oh my God. I'm so inspired by you all. It's amazing. I want to kick off actually the conversation by going right back at you, Jasmine. I'm hoping that you can tell people about the ball exhibition that you're going to do for the Bronx Museum. It's deeply critical of institutional spaces. It's absolute fantastic example of curatorial feminism. It's exhibition as critique. Or institutional critique. But I think it would be really interesting for people to hear about the non-binary community that you've brought together and brought into an institutional space where they would never have been welcome. And I think that's really an interesting kind of conversation, and also how you are going to deal with this sort of dichotomy of exploitation in and around that.
Sure. So one of the exhibitions that I'm doing next year, and it has not been announced yet, so secret insider information for all of you. No, that's totally fine. It will be announced very soon. Is an exhibition on the history of ball culture, history and contemporary of ball culture, going back about 50 years. So it will be part historical, part contemporary art. And what my aim is for this exhibition is to bring new lenses or multiple lenses to the history of ball culture, which predominantly and historically we have seen through the lens of whiteness or otherness. And what I'm doing as part of my curatorial effort is inviting members of the ball community. I think in total there will be 5 of us as curatorial partners, because the story of ball culture is not really mine to tell exclusively. I'm just a facilitator in this instance. And with the question of gaze, it's unavoidable. You know, there's always a tension between being seen and being exploited. And anecdotally, the idea for having, I guess, for lack of a better word, a democratized curatorial approach or pluralistic curatorial approach for this particular exhibition came from a observation that I had at another exhibition oriented around ball culture, in which members of the community came to the gallery where the show was being held and pointed at one of the performers, community members, and said, "Is it okay if this person is in here?" And to me, that is the epitome of institutional, unsurprising, yet nonetheless upsetting institutional violence. And so I understand the hesitation and the resistance that many people may have towards having a historical narrative told in the institutional space, which is why I'm trying to have as many voices in that mix, in the hopes that some of that can be addressed. And again, I see the show as for multiple communities, but the primary community is the ball community, and is the New York City QTPOC community, and I'm hoping to be as transparent as possible. I'm not hoping, I am going to be as transparent as possible about the problematic nature of putting shows that are socio and sociopolitically oriented into an institutional space, when institutional spaces in the Western world were really created on the foundation of hegemonic white supremacy as places to keep people out. And so aside from burning everything down to the ground and starting from the ashes, how can we work within a framework to build from within, which I think all of the other curators and Patty are all doing. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's wonderful. And thank you for sharing. I'm sorry I put you on the spot and like you're announcing something before it's, but I wanted to, you know, you just touched on something. It's, you know, the idea of belonging. And in previous conversations, for those that are watching, we talked previously to this, and both Jasmine and Cecilia mentioned that they started to do the work that they do from a space of non-belonging. You know, feeling obviously a lack of representation in the field. You talked about like not only on the walls, but in the writing and in the staffing. I think Patty could argue the same thing, right? Feeling like she's not belonging. It's interesting too in relation to the ball show, right? Like you're actually going to assist a community in feeling like they belong in the Bronx Museum. And kudos to the Bronx Museum for doing that kind of work. I mean, amazing. But along those lines, I don't know, Cecilia or Patty, you know, just the idea of belonging, is that kind of rooted in sort of your art making? Let's just start with Patty. I mean.
Absolutely. I mean, what am I doing in the cemetery of the powerful? You know what I mean? Like, of course, that's part of it. But really, the real crux was not belonging in our society legally. My legal status couldn't be equal to other people. So there was that in terms of gay marriage being prohibited, but also walking around. I mean, we're having a national conversation about public statues and public sculptures. I've been thinking and working on this for 20 years, you know, walking around New York City and finding Mother Goose, Alice in Wonderland, and then 3 other real women in all of Manhattan. And just until 2 weeks ago, that was still the truth. So yes, walking around and not, you know, either seeing your reflection, there's a couple things, not seeing your reflection in the culture, like it's just missing, or seeing it as so distorted that you don't recognize it. yes, that makes you feel like you don't belong, absolutely. And I'm just gonna do one little pop culture thing, which is Schitt's Creek, which was this series on TV, and there was a gay son. Dan Levy played it and wrote the part. And at the end of the series, he said, I wanted to make a show where homophobia just didn't exist. And you don't realize it until you've watched all the episodes. And I thought, oh, that's what I'm trying to do with my work. I'm just making it like, well, yes, I should be treated with dignity like everyone else should be treated with dignity. Just like all those women in Shrine for Girls should be treated with dignity. Everyone should. So I just make work where, yes, that's my given, even if the world doesn't agree.
Oh. Well, Patty, just following up on that, dignity. Can you tell folks about the portraits that you made of the individual portraits that you made of these women, the girls, which, are another corollary kind of show or just group or body of work that giving them dignity. I mean, maybe you can tell people a little bit about that series.
Well, while I was waiting for all the wheels to turn with the Diocese of Venice giving me permission to use the church and the Venice Biennale office, I'm an artist, I have to make things. So I made portraits of some of these individuals from all three events. And I thought it was another way to give them dignity. It's like, who gets to have their portrait painted, right? Basically the rich and the powerful. And I thought, well, they deserve portraits as well. And so that's what I would be working on in my studio before I had access to, really installing the exhibition.
And they're absolutely stunning. If you have an image, throw it up in the chat. I also had a question, for Nur and Cecilia. I think I want to tell you just how inspirational you both are for the work that you're doing. I mean, understanding like the strength and resilience that's required to do something that's absolutely museum altering and discipline altering in the case of Cecilia by doing these massive blockbuster Latinx exhibitions. I don't know, maybe Cecilia, I know you had a hard time getting your show off the ground, and I think it's good for people to hear that, the kind of work that we do, this political curatorial activist work, just you hit so many blocks and so many barriers, but you just keep pushing through. And I think what you've done I think people need to know the story a little bit, if you're okay with that.
No, and also I wanted to touch also on the issue of belonging. I mean, I think there is always something profoundly autobiographical about everything we do. I mean, every single one of the stories and work that every one of you have done has somehow related to the fact that we have actually experienced in our own body forms of exclusion, prejudice, and so forth. And for example, regarding the Chicanx people and Latinx people, I feel I'm a migrant in this country and I've been treated as such. The thing is, I had a brown father, but I look more white than brown. But the fact is, my experience has been of a migrant person. And one of the things I admire of someone like a Chicanx person, they have created their own forms of affectivity, the way that their art circulates, the way that they actually affirm their own culture. So despite the fact, even though they were here before anybody, or because, for example, California was the US, was Mexico before, they actually create a sense of belonging constantly. They carve out their own notions of what being in America, what being themselves is. And I feel that, so these exhibitions become existential exhibitions because they actually talk about something profoundly vital. And I know that, through Radical Women, I was thrown out of a museum for years. I lost a job, and it was so strong, this rejection, even from my own colleagues, to think that to do something like that was patriarchal, because I don't know, it's like this history upside down. And also now with this Chicanx exhibition is not easy either, because the reality normally is absent, so there is 100 excuses for that not to it. So what happens is that when you do an exhibition like that, you have to be prepared to be somehow to fight and somehow to be marginalized. For me, the history says that Latin America is more important than Latinx art. So in theory, for me, from having moved from Radical Women to Latinx is the wrong move from a career point of view. And that is completely wrong. You move in the direction of what is needed, what is important, what is relevant. And that's how I identify myself as a Latinx person, as a brown body, as a woman, as an intersectional person, whatever. So I want to be there. It's not about this kind of notion of a career, which again is another patriarchal idea, but it's not easy. You know, as a mother with 2 children divorced, trying to exist in this country, it's virtually impossible to do one's work.
And thank you for sharing that, because it's all the more courageous. And again, it's urgent work that you're doing. And I think that's one of the things that is the through line through curatorial activist work, is that it's urgent. And it has to be done, and we have to do it, right? And that
Urgent, so much art is urgent, isn't it? All these artists that are producing all this culture that exist because it needs to exist. It's like the air you breathe. So somehow curatorial practice cannot be like a hierarchy that sort of creates some sort of an order and pigeonholes and establishes categories and so forth. It has to be coexist in this sort of a sense of respect and ethics.
Absolutely.
Shared.
Couldn't agree more. And I think I'm sure you were inspired along those lines by Nur's work. I'd love to hear more. Also, yeah, I mean, Nur, again, I mean, we've all been kind of stunned by the amount of, I don't know, what you've been able to accomplish in 3 months, right? With this incredible group. But one thing I'd love for you to tell folks too, again, I'm trying to emphasize how courageous this work is that we're all doing. I'd love for you to tell people, Nur, about the press and how they've reacted to the work that you've done, and the right-wing hate groups that you've had to reconcile with. I think people would want to know that.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild story, actually. So we sort of have spent, I say this collective of curators who are working to decolonize the institution. We basically, we did this, we produced this new interpretation, we wrote these reports and open letters that got circulated quite widely within the institution. And maybe I would say a few weeks after that, the sort of began to appear in the right-wing press in the UK a number of stories that clearly had access to the internal reports and open letters and demands for racial justice and social justice from within the institution. And the press basically very deliberately misrepresented the content of the reports and the content of the demands that we were making. And so it started with one newspaper, and then it got picked up by a number of other newspapers, and there was sort of a period of about a week, 2 weeks where there was this sort of constant, I mean, it really felt like an onslaught of negative sort of right-wing misrepresentations of the work that was going on within the institution. I think there were a couple of things happening there. One is that because it's a national institution, right, and it has the word British in the title, there was, and because British imperialism has not been interrogated in any way in kind of mainstream British culture or education, the fact that we were challenging the, I guess, I mean, the fact that we were calling out the inherent violence in British imperialist history, resulted in this sort of right-wing press reaction. And there were calls to defund the library, for the chief librarian to resign, for everyone involved in the decolonizing group to be fired, and sort of, and then there were, there appeared on sort of Facebook right-wing groups, these, sort of naming people who were in the decolonizing group, because we had tried to keep it anonymous, with a view to sort of, I would go so far as to say with a view to targeting us personally. So it sort of escalated very quickly from what we thought would be, we assumed that our work would either be met kind of either with indifference, right, or with, or well received. And yet the violent backlash in the press was really quite something, quite astonishing. So, for instance, I would have really liked to have shared with you the building audit and our open letter for demands for change, but I'm not sure how advisable that would be, given the controversy that they caused. But I mean, in a way, we can almost wear this as a badge of pride that we seem to have really shifted something. To have really destabilized something, if we're having sort of, a backlash and sort of, not, I wouldn't even say sort of niche newspapers, like mainstream kind of right-wing newspapers, picked up the story. So
yeah, you shared some of that with us.
I just add really quickly, I agree with you. Being featured on the front page of Breitbart was actually the crowning achievement of my career. For
yeah,
that
we made it
very
into
reason.
Breitbart. We made it into Breitbart as well, and you're kind of like, okay, that's, you know, we've done something. If Breitbart are attacking us.
What a compliment. So this, we were going to ask, I don't know if the panelists have anything that they would like to ask each other, and then we were going to open it up, I think, Malvika, right? Yeah, okay.
I would have liked to ask because, you know, there was this issue that Wahi mentioned about producing work for an audience that is, you know, is the community itself, and not trying to actually convince anybody of anything. So, but then, you know, some works, you know, for example, the work that someone does in a collection requires, if there are no works from particular people in a collection, they will never be seen in the museum, they will never. So there are these different layers. Also, for example, your tomb being at the Smithsonian Institution, you know, what actually happens then when these pieces enter the institution, or, you know, or like what happens in the case of this colonial collection and the rereading. So it seems that there are all these different possibilities of things that can be done from within the institution, from outside the institution, from the artist's point of view, from the curator, the writer. So I wanted to ask a little bit about this, you know, the future, what's going to happen with the collection of the British Museum now there has been this backlash, or how Patricia feels that, you know, her work functions within this the Smithsonian Institution, the Brooklyn Museum, you know, once it enters, what does it change?
A great question. Yeah. Patricia, you want to take that?
So one thing I'd say is that the Smithsonian did do a very good job with the wall label. You know, the didactic wall label next to the sculpture. You know, they didn't. They identified it as, you know, a romantic lesbian couple who were now married. I mean, it was very pretty progressive for the Smithsonian. I mean, it's not. I'm not going to say it's identical, but there are some similarities in terms of it's our national portrait gallery. In the United States. How does it change the sculpture? I don't know that it changes it, but it allows more people to see, you know, basically marriage equality writ large in something really heavy and big. And a lot of, you know, I made it because I needed it. I needed something official. I never knew it was going to have this impact on other people. And you know, I do get Instagram messages a lot, and people are very teary, and it's helped them in some kind of way, you know, healing, identification, you know, representation. And I think it's been a positive thing.
Yeah, it's like the idea has disseminated more broadly than if you had just kept it in the Bronx Cemetery. Right, so it allows the ideas and the radicality to disseminate widely, and I think that's so critical. I mean, I feel like that when I want to curate an exhibition, I want as many people as possible to see it, because you're trying to make a political statement and make a difference and maybe change the lens. But Patty, can you just quickly tell people, because you didn't mention it shockingly, the sculpture, what artists were you looking at for inspiration? Because I think it's really interesting.
Oh, well, I mean, if I'm going to do the neoclassical form, I have to be looking at, you know, previous lesbian couples in art. So of course, Courbet's The Sleepers. You know, it's the only painting I knew that had anything, that had, you know, any representation in the history of art. But also the ancient hermaphrodite was really inspirational, because it was also such a controversial figurative sculpture. And then I would say Henry William Reinhardt's The Two Sleeping Babies, which is a neoclassical 19th century sculpture. But those were the three that I was really the most interested in. And then Felix Gonzalez Torres, Perfect Lovers.
But I guess my point is too, you're usurping a male visual language for your own ends. And
yes, and inserting my personal political content into it, hoping to transform it.
Exactly. Do anybody else want to ask each other something, or?
Oh, I have so many.
Or Malvika, did you want to open it up?
Yeah, thank you all so much. This has been absolutely phenomenal. We've had a very interesting questions.
It's hard to hear you.
Oh, okay. How is that? Better? We've had a number of really compelling questions come in from the audience, and our first will come from our very own
Thank you, Malvika. I just want to start by thanking all of you today. This has been a really amazing and inspiring conversation. So thank you, Patricia, Cecilia, Maura, Nur, and Jasmine. My question is like, admittedly, kind of opening a new can of worms, but I feel I must ask it because I'm so curious what you all think. But of course, we're talking about curatorial activism and you know, what curators can do, what artists, of course, can do. And I'm thinking to like the sort of corporate structure of how institutions work. And my mind goes to the Whitney Biennial, thinking of Warren Kanders and that controversy. And there was the success, of course, of him resigning. But I'm also thinking like the Sacklers in connection to the Met and Nan Goldin's response to that. So I'm curious what you all think of like how the general public relates to these corporate structures and like terms of accountability. And this seems really connected, Nur, to what your group did. So for lack of a better question, I'm just curious how you all think the public can kind of be conscious and do something about these sort of, you know, really embedded corporate structures.
Well, I can just add on that. Well, first of all, I think what's interesting is we've been talking about artistic activism, curatorial activism, and now library activism, which I think is great. We should write a separate book called that. But I think, you know, the interesting, you know, the part about the Whitney Museum, I mean, the increased corporatization of museums from the 1980s onward has trickled down into really, really problematic issues, including toxic philanthropy, but also a board's control of exhibition content. You know, Jasmine's lucky to be at the Bronx Museum, right? I mean, Cecilia could if you were working inside, you know, the Brooklyn Museum or MoMA or the Guggenheim, would you be able to kind of move mountains and do that kind of work, or do you have to be an independent curator? And I think the corporatization of museums plays a really oppressive role, right? That the 1% of the 1% are in charge of our institutions, and they're hiring their, you know, the CEO directors now, right? Looking for someone with business management experience. So I think it is opening a whole can of worms, but the corporatization is a pretty, I think, dire and urgent thing that we need to deal with. But I don't know if anybody else has a response.
And I guess I can just say from my perspective, like, sure, it's so the library in many respects functions as a museum. Like, we do exhibitions, for instance. We have you know, the same toxic philanthropists that everyone else has, the Sacklers, all of that. It's the structure is, you know, I mean, it is a library, but we also display art, we hold art. So one of the things, and your question about audiences and publics is very interesting, right? Like and I kind of want to link it with Jasmine's comments about co-curating, right? And how that kind of has to be, and I think Cecilia mentioned something similar about that really has to be like foundational to conceptualizing an exhibition. So one exhibition that we're now planning at the library, but you know, it's an exhibition, so I guess library/museum, right, is around the representation of Islam and Muslim communities in Europe from the early modern period to the present. And one of the ways in which the corporate structure of the institution is difficult to overcome is that from day one, the curatorial team said, we need to curate this exhibition together with the Muslim diaspora communities of London, who are very, very populous. I mean, I'm sitting right now in Tower Hamlets, which is almost 40% Muslim, primarily Bangladeshi. These are audiences who do not view the British Library necessarily as their to be entitled to be in that space. Before I had a job there, I did not view myself as being entitled to be in that space, right? So, you know, there are ways in which you need to kind of, you know, like Jasmine was saying, make the exhibition for the community that's being portrayed in the exhibition. And one thing I would say sort of in the way that the corporate structure of the organization works is that, and I would be really interested to hear from Jasmine on this, tactics actually for how to get around this, is that while the curators might be very interested in, from day one, conceptualizing the exhibition and the artwork and the themes with the communities who are being represented, the institution doesn't have a notion of that and how to do it. So we find ourselves kind of banging our heads every meeting we have about this against a structure for, you know, the way that exhibitions are planned that does not accommodate for the flexibility that would be required to curate an exhibition with a community for a community. So if Jasmine has any reflections on that, or anyone else, Cecilia, I would really be keen to hear about that.
So the reason that I did not join the institutional space for my entire career was basically for that reason, for the perception of that type of, I guess, gatekeeping or top-down influence, which is why I started an organization mostly because I couldn't find my place anywhere else. So I just did a sort of rogue element kind of thing. I will say though, I think I'm in a particularly unique situation at the Bronx Museum in that its mission has always been to be communities centric, both for the immediate geographical community, but also for the wider communities. And so thus far, I have had the immense privilege of you know, a board and colleagues who've been very open to this idea of being community centric without feeling like we are pandering to a community or condescending to a community. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that because I've just been really, really lucky, you know, and also by the nature of the fact that the museum has a social justice curator, I think is probably telling of their, where their values are, I guess. So maybe Cecilia can answer better than I can.
You, because somehow the way I've done my major projects has always been as a guest curator. So you can sort of stir the pot for a little bit and then off you go, grab your stuff and go. Because it's difficult, you know, to have someone who is critical, that pushes for, you know, when I was the chief curator of the MOLA, I kept insisting, how can you have a museum of Latin American art and ignore the Latinx community? And I was said again and again and again, the Latinx people are not part of the story. And so in the end, it was an impossible situation. When I started to think of doing Radical Women, I was in Miami. There was a complete disinterest on the notion of doing an exhibition on the contribution of women to Latin American art. So somehow I've had to really kind of find my way through how I can actually do. And of course, I do quite a lot of stuff in Latin America. And sometimes you work in very, very difficult conditions. But if you're allowed to do things that are relevant, that you can do them in dialogue with artists in the community, then it becomes completely meaningful. Though, so yeah, I mean, I would like to think that there exists a possibility to work within an institution that allows you the freedom to truly have agency, because, you know, now that there is all this discussion about, you know, inequity and Black Lives Matter, the way that they've been using Black images in museums to pretend that they care about Black Lives Matter, I feel that the solution is really sort of possible. There are lots of clever, wonderful scholars, curators, art historians, Black, Latina, American out there. It's not happening. So for me, it's completely clear the museums need to change, need to give agency to people. Well, I would say like me, or like many, you know, or like you, or any of you, to truly do things that are self-critical. You know, the colonization happens by being self-critical of the institution first and foremost. You know, like So anyway, I don't lose the hope, but I feel that is hard. It's hard, you know, and depends, you know, if you're a woman, if you're dark, if you're middle-aged, and, you know, it goes on and on and on. The complexity is like this big tangle of difficulties.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the awareness, though, to institute broad change, we need directors and executive directors to open their minds to notions of difference and to understand the urgency of dealing with you know, racial injustice. I mean, it's on, you know, it's top-down management. I mean, the reason that we moved mountains at the Brooklyn Museum and founded a center dedicated to feminist art is because Arnold Lehman is an incredibly brilliant and caring and empathetic person. I don't think most museum directors are. And I think they're there, you know, kind of thinking about their, again, this maintenance of corporatization. We need to change it at the top. I think if we want to, you know, really institute and move the conversation forward, it needs to be, those are the people we need to target. But that's just my 2 cents.
Can I just chime in? Am I unmuted? Yes. I think that we just have to put our bodies, I mean, I can only speak as an artist, so I'm an audience member. Hold the museums accountable. If they're doing stuff wrong, show up for those protests and decolonize this space, right? Don't go in and see the show. Put your money, put your body, even in a pandemic, it's even more crucial where we put our bodies. You know, try, if you can, you know, try to eat at the cafe at that restaurant when the ball show is up at the Bronx Museum, right? Make sure you get the tote bag, make sure you get the catalog, and make sure you put it on social media as much as you can, and really do as individuals, and get all your friends to support the institutions that are really making a difference.
Thank you all for,
Let's all clap on that one, though. That's so true. Yes. I mean, yes. Snap, snap. Okay. Sorry, Malvika.
no, truly phenomenal. We've had like a number of very interesting audience questions, but in the interest of time, I think our final question will come from our very own captain of the ship, whose birthday it is today as well.
Ah.
What? You mean you wouldn't allow other people to ask, Malvika? There's no.
I can take it back and go through the line if you'd like.
Is that okay with you guys? Can you spare another 5-10 minutes? Let's take a few more questions.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
All right. So then our next question will come from the lovely Amalia Caputo. Amalia, you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Hi. I thank you all for this amazing presentation. My question goes specifically to Nur, but anybody could answer if they have something to tell me. My question pertains basically after the understanding of the decolonization of an institution like the British Library. My curiosity relies on what happens in the case of the object that is considered of art itself, because most of the objects that were colonized and brought in were not even considered art. That's a Western, Occidental, white, male concept. So what happens to the object? How do you foresee the treatment of these objects in the process of decolonization? Can you see possible a decolonization of the object? If so, and curatorially, how would you think of that process? Thank you.
This is a brilliant, brilliant question, and I can see the other panelists nodding, and perhaps they will have more to say about that. Yeah, it's everything that you've said is absolutely spot on. I work more with manuscripts as opposed to objects, which are, it's a little bit of a different dynamic. But as far as objects are concerned and the kind of like the way that they became objects, right? The way that they became art objects is a colonial process, right? And a very violent process by which they were turned into art objects. Is it possible to undo that, to unturn them into objects, or to unturn them into, you know, from art objects back into their utilitarian context? I honestly don't know. So the way that my collections maybe map onto your question, right? And I work primarily with large manuscript collections, which sometimes are illustrated, sometimes really deal with knowledge production, is that So I work with one collection that was basically removed from Delhi in 1857 when the British fundamentally like sort of destroyed the city and took over India sort of and you know sort of became a colonial power as opposed to just the East India Company. They removed from the city of Delhi something like 2,500 volumes of manuscripts, right? So what you basically have is a kind of devastation of the intellectual culture of a city, right, in the mid-19th century. These manuscripts now exist in the basement of the British Library, where they remain. The fundamental epistemic damage and violence that was done by the removal of those materials and the destruction of the knowledge traditions that happened as a result of that is undoable, right? And it has shaped the trajectory of communities of knowledge, particularly in sort of Islamic South Asia, from that moment until the present. So that is kind of the set of questions that I'm working with, is like, given that this immense epistemic violence and damage has happened, now what do we do? Now what do we do with these huge collections that are here, that physically exist in a space in London, that are fundamentally inaccessible and that have led to these major to epistemicide, basically, right, in the context of this particular set of materials. If the other curate panelists perhaps have something to say about objects, and obviously repatriation is lurking in the background of this question as well, right, and the meaning of repatriation. And I could also talk about that for hours at length and the many aspects of it, particularly in relation to South Asia and colonialism in South Asia. But I actually want to give the other panelists a chance to talk about this.
I'll just throw in though, just quickly that Fong, I think you should do a panel on repatriation. It's just, oh my God, talk about opening up a can of worms, but also talk about something that needs to be urgently talked about, urgently. But anyway, I'll allow the panelists to answer.
Well, I mean, for me, the whole issue is that the idea of art in Western terms is what needs to be challenged. So the notion of forms of epistemology, forms of material culture, forms of knowledge, forms of writing, forms of aesthetics, is all somehow needs to sort of be exhibited in ways that expands Western notions of starting value of culture, hierarchies. So I think, you know, more than thinking of A with capital A, I think of sort of the broader notion of culture and what it means to give access to those materials which are in the basements, you know, to actually a wider public. And I mean, the fact that, you know, so many people don't feel the need or the inclination to go to museums is because they're not reflected in there. If there is such an enormous community, you know, South Asian community in London, I mean, that material will be so incredibly enlightening and valuable and wonderful. And yeah, but I feel that the word art needs to be sort of sidelined as the main concept, as the main voice, and let all these other fine woven notions, which are culturally specifics, to actually come to the fore.
Perfect. Full response. Malvika, did you want to move on to another question?
Question is coming from Maria Fajardo-Hill. Maria, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Wait, sorry, you have to speak more loudly. We didn't hear you.
Our next question is coming from Maria Fajardo-Hill, who should be able to turn on her microphone now.
Yes. Thank you so much, Malvika, and thank you, Maura, and all of the panelists for an amazing session. My question is for Nur. As someone who also works on historical collections in a university museum in particular, I'm very interested in how your colleagues in other departments at the British Library are also, or are they also engaging in these decolonizing efforts, and how is that being sort of supported by the British Library? And I'm thinking particularly, and yes, I would love another session on repatriation, but thinking particularly about issues of provenance in different periods. My particular area was Western manuscripts, so medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, but there are stories of, you know, violence and of other kinds of collecting violence, if you want. And so I'm just curious how that affects the other departments at the British Library.
Sure. So I would say that the efforts to decolonize and the collective group of curators who are engaged in decolonizing cuts across all of the departments. It cuts across all of the collections, right? So we have people in the who work with Western, you know, manuscripts. We have people who work across the full geography of kind of all of the areas that are covered in the collections, both printed and manuscript and art. What you also have is a pushback against decolonization that also cuts across all of the departments in the library. So I mean, it's you know, there's so many. It's a very populous, you know, site of knowledge production and curating. So there's certainly not one particular. I would say some people support it, others are adamantly opposed to it. And I would say that this encounter is echoed throughout all of even like the conservation studios, right? You have people who are adamant radical decolonizers and people who are opposed to it. Even in our learning team, in the security teams, in, you know, really it cuts across every, you know, it's reflected in every microcosm of every area of the library, I would say. So we are getting a lot of support as well, I should say, even from our senior management. We're also getting a lot of pushback. So if that kind of answers your question, it's not, you know, kind of all one way. We are getting support. We're also getting a lot of resistance.
For our final question, we'll go to our very own Fong Bui. Fong?
Thank you, you guys. We should go as long as need to go. This is one of the things that we do. For Trump deploys speed for power, we deploy slowness for culture. So that's what it is about. So you know, when I heard, thank you so much for all of your observation, and thank you for organizing this first of many to come, Maura. This is just terrific. Give me so much hope. So why here in particularly, Jasmine mentioned Bell Hope. And I remember the first book I read of her was called Belonging, a cultural place. May have been late 80s or 1990. And managed to meet her later. So it was an amazing memory meeting Bell and even have dinner. And that book was important to me too, because she went back to study her own place, birthplace in Kentucky, and began to question what does it mean to call a place a home. You know, who would be regarded as a member of the community, and then when can you say that you truly belong to the community? So all of that was very important to me too, because you know, having co-founded the Rail is part of that process. Find it outside the mainstream, you know, publication, so you have a voice for the broader idea. Because right now, I went back and reread a very wonderful essay that was published in The Nation 1915 by Horace Cowlen, Kawlen. It's called Democracy versus Melting Pot. It's a very interesting article because it, you know, melting pot simply means assimilation into Anglo-Saxon American identity in that period of time. So you think about, for example, Swedish, you know, immigrant came to America, most likely they find a place that would remind them of their own weather, you know. So the Swedish went to Minneapolis or Minnesota, where the German migrate above in Wisconsin. And you know, the Irish went to Boston, for example. The Italian somehow ended in Philadelphia. I mean, there's more other example of similar kind. So they're not really melting. The idea is that they create their own community so they can amplify the history, the language, the, the mannerism, all of it, folklore and whatnot. It's very intense because when we have our own friend recently, Jennifer Jones Austin, who runs the FWWA, I think, Federation for Processing Worker or Welfare Agency, and she made a comment that I never thought of. She felt the reason why Obama was elected to be the president because he's half black. And I never thought of it. So until recently, again, same thing with Kamala Harris. So is that a codified aesthetic presentation that we are being told that this is a middle ground, this is the compromise can be made. So that whole melting pot versus democracy, it's very problematic, very problematic. So I don't know, I'm thinking about how does that apply in our current time, especially regard to what we do as aesthetic workers. We love art and culture, visual culture particularly, the mind and the body, that whole predicament that we have been told and studied for so long. So I'm just raising that up just to see how that can be resolved in the codified symbol, image, or anything that is chosen to represent in the larger context. Because all of you have very particular personal vision of what that means. And it's very profound and it's very personally invested. So I think the more of this dialogue is the better to figure out how we can work together. So that's my finally deep appreciation to you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Fong. Thank you. Yes, and many more, because these women are so inspirational. And I think that's what gives us hope. Is this kind of work, right? It's this kind of work that gives us hope. Yeah.
Thank you so much to all of you. Is my sound better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Marginally, great. So at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending lunch with a poem. We've been lucky enough to carry that into these community events. And today I'm thrilled to welcome the poet Camilo Roldan to the virtual Zoom stage. Camilo Roldan is a Colombian-American poet and translator. His first full-length book of poems, Dropout, was published in 2019 in a translation of Maria Paz Guerrera's book, God is a Bitch Too, is forthcoming from UDP in December 2020. Camilla, you should be able to activate your mic.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Yes, sounds good. All right. It's such an honor to be here. This was a fantastic conversation. I really find it all very pertinent for me as well as a translator. We encounter a lot of these issues of like, who are we selecting and why and all of this stuff. So, so thank you to Maura, Patricia, Cecilia, Jasmine, Nur. Thank you to Malvika and everybody else at the Brooklyn Rail for this amazing opportunity. And yes, so I'm very excited to read for you. I'm going to read a little bit from the book that I put out, Dropout, which there's a link for in the Eventbrite page, and also I believe on the Brooklyn Rail page for this event. And I'm going to read just an excerpt from, I'm going to read a couple of different things, but I'm going to read an excerpt from a long poem that is mostly about the work of an artist named Lee Lozano, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And the name of the poem is Dropout Poem, which of course takes its name from her Dropout piece. There's a really great book about that by Sarah Lehrer Graver, I believe is how you say her name. Yeah, so I'm just gonna go ahead and read that, and then I'll read a couple of other things. When Lozano cast off the art object, she cast herself aside too, denied herself access, silence, deliberately swelled, increased into swell of line break, became a poem whose eventual return wrote in 1998 her questionnaire with jokes concerning purchases and purchasers of my art. How would you make that gesture? Who are your readers? How invested have they become? Poets, academics, some artists, art historians, critics, Sarah, Laura, Cheryl, Helen, or Lucy, the woman you claim to love, Lozano's ghost, mortified, men, an endless list of powerful men. Are they rich, comfortable? Do they have real jobs, salaries? Do they speak a second language, French, German, or Spanish? Finally put out that book. Will someone teach it? Did they read it online or in a lit journal published somewhere west of New York and east of LA? Will someone review it? Will they talk about terrible things you've written over a glass or two of Pernod? Or will they talk about the terrible things you've done? Pushed to the very misanthropic, like Tom Otterness shooting a pound dog for art, like Lieutenant Thomas Glan, who executed his hunting dog, Aesop, as a parting gift because woman A would not love him and woman B died. What was the moral? Does extreme egg extreme? Be water, move in ever-replenishing doubt. When Lozano cast herself aside, she cast off the market, gave up shows, changed her name, dropped Lozano, née Lenore Canaster, to become singular E. E left for Dallas. E stopped making art. E committed a form of conceptual suicide, became pure energy, seeping from a vent below a chasm in her own sanctuary, inhaled deeply and spoke for herself, perhaps realized from moment to moment she was able to be a numinous know thyself, inscribed herself, E, into the lintels above, inscribed the stone in her life, liberated in a single notebook page. Dropout Peace is the hardest work I have ever done, 1970. And was never heard from again, or so says her Vida, though she may have teetered on the outskirts for a lid, smoked the best of herself, meandered, dallied with the decent men she knew, chalked up by her enemies under the coinage acid casualty, a grid of blotter paper with UFOs or Mickey Mice, like a psychedelic chessboard that asks you to turn on the cinematic experience of perpetually proceeding, not located in any one place. Tune in to her piece, the music of a letter E squirting through the cosmos. Drop out of writing poems, reenact the nature of the original piece, and make art your life, on stage, with the band, even without a Wi-Fi signal, as a letter to an old friend living in a distant land, in transit, two separate actions, two people are fragments, and the only record of the gesture, the memory. Somewhere at the other end of all this, she sits at a desk with a headset listening to men proclaim their love in the form of a customer complaint, obligated to help them resolve the issue, restart their modems, empty their browser caches, listens and listens to men recount dreams of her, anxious to hear her proclamations, unwilling to mute their personal problems long enough, waits for the delay caused by the satellite connection between Bumblefuck, Texas and Germany, listens briefly to you, and then, moving on with her life, gently whispers her advice. Drop out. I moved to Bogota, Colombia about 3 years ago, and haven't really been writing in English since then. So I'm gonna read a very short poem in Spanish, and only in Spanish, called Soneto 18. Candidato para el olvido, soy puerco espín, elijo desvanecer y lo logro en español. Soy el puerco espín que se dobla sobre sí. Solo sé una cosa, sé aceptar mi suerte y en aceptar elijo. Y me lastimo y lloro y luego sigo vivo. Soy las púas que rechazan todo lo que no sea mí mismo. Y ahí se clavan, y donde otros aprenden, miro el mundo con ojos que solo revelan desprecio. Descanso sobre mi lanza y me echo sobre la punta. No hay sangre ni enemigos, solo agujeros y lanzas para más. And just as a last little bit here, I'd like to read from a translation that, as was mentioned in the bio, is coming out this December from Ugly Duckling Press, UDP. It's by a poet named Maria Paz Guerrero. And the poem in Spanish, the book is called Dios también es una perra. And in English, the title is God is a Bitch Too. God is 53 years old, wrinkled. God is menopausal, is outraged, hates his bloated body. God is now a broad-backed fridge. God has lost his curves. God is temporal and time attacks his figure. God goes out dancing with his new body and his faded face, takes a seat at a table in the salsa club because God is also Latin American. God has had to fight to defend himself in the Rational Academy, has been discovering with life's knocks that he is a cannibal. God is a bitch too, and right now he's a fat, wrinkly bitch. His period has been drying up intermittently. God goes dancing. When he goes out into the street, he sees trash, mountains of trash piled on the corners, a homeless person who picks old food out of a bag, another sleeping in the middle of the sidewalk. God sees a neighborhood of poor houses painted in bright colors. God goes to the poor neighborhood's corner store to buy bananas, to buy almond milk, because now he's vegan, but there isn't any milk like that in the corner store. He goes to buy olives to make a pasta because God is alone in his house. God is divorced. God doesn't have a partner, but there aren't any olives. God sees people go into the store and sees them buy 2 tomatoes, a stalk of green onion, half a pound of rice. They buy in small quantities. They buy menopausally. God thinks that his emotional center is lack, that he should meditate to find his light because his trauma is lack. So he's fascinated by the poor who are lack become people. He goes to the poor neighborhood and feels at home. God goes dancing. God has to write 15 pages of poetry. This is page 40, and there's at least another 15 to go. If God finishes 55 pages, God can publish. God wants money so he can learn English, get on an airplane as is, divorced, menopausal, lacking, always lacking, because that is his childhood trauma. He catches an airplane with his poor friends, with those at the bottom, though he knows he isn't so low, but more in the middle, pitching toward the top. God imagines he catches an airplane to try to be less lacking and go to New York. Finally, because God wasn't educated in the empire. That's why he's anachronistic, because he doesn't speak English. God has 2 sins, not speaking the language of the great and being God, and another 2, his lack and his inability to be vegan. He has another one, and that one's the worst. God is a poet who feels, but cannot accept it because he wants to be famous, to sense that only he is right, that he and a select few are artists who eat meat, and the Amazon is laid waste as they chew. After the launch party for his book of poems, they go out to eat a good asado de tira, because now in this Latin American world, we too are cosmopolitan. Now the restaurants are Korean, Vietnamese, Indian, Argentinian in our cities with streets for the rich and streets for the poor. So God eats a good bife de chorizo, orders a carmener, gets drunk. The ranchers have given orders to displace indigenous people, and if they won't leave, to kill them. They've also given orders to set that mallow forest on fire, to murder monkeys, families of monkeys, masses of monkeys. There's a lot of jungle, burn it, I'll pay. The guy has a family of hungry children with bloated stomachs and no underwear who play in putrid waters, fecal waters. The rancher is going to give him good money. With that, he'll put cement on the dirt floors. He'll buy a dress for the baby girl, a toy gun for the youngest. He'll have his aguardiente. He knows where to buy gasoline and how to start a good fire. God wants to pay for an English class, to feel New York on his poet's skin, to finally feel that he's worldly, that he knows how to write. He'll finally be able to read Sylvia Plath in her language, to hear her music, her vowels, see if they liven up his Spanish, which is very South American, find out if he can cut a line a la Sylvia Plath. God doesn't know that when he gets to New York, he will discover so much worldliness, it will give him anxiety. He will feel like a piece of shit, Sudaka, anachronistic, passé, vanguard cannibal, a poor poet who still suffers like a lab rat, who still wants a lover to hold him at night in the rat trap he pays heaps of dollars to live in, to be an artist, to finally be a contemporary artist. Thanks. So, keep your eyes out for that translation, and have a good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. A real honor. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Camilo. That was wonderful and really feisty. And thank you so much to all our lovely panelists. Thank you, Patty. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Nur, for sharing your work with us. That was exquisite. And thank you so much to Maura, who organized all of this today with such rigor and such grace. And thank you to everyone who came out today in the audience and in the chat. Please join us again tomorrow for the New Social Environment, when we will be joined by Director of the Musée d'Orsay and the Musée de l'Orangerie, Laurence Descartes, in conversation with friend and board member of the Rail, Helen Lee, as well as Rail Consulting Editor, Joachim Pizarro. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Isa Guzman. That will be, as always, at 1 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, right here in the Zoom. Thank you all for tuning in. You can now activate your microphones if you so desire and say goodbye as you leave. But this has been really—
Hi, everybody.
Thank you so
This
much.
was great.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Jasmine, Nur, Cecilia, Maura, Nick.
Thanks.
Happy birthday,
Great.
Fong.
Happy Debbie.
Thank you. Great conversation today.
Oh.
What was that? Thank you.